Alex, in the last couple of years, wrote 2 books about the most important lessons he's learned related to effectively leading nonprofits and the related issue of self-care for mission-driven professionals, Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind, and very recently, When in Doubt, Ask for More, and 213 other life and career lessons for the mission-driven leader. I know an excerpt was sent to all of you, and these books are available on Amazon as well. So without further ado, I would like to invite Alex to share with us his story and lessons learned while hopefully not losing his mind. And I just want to remind everyone to keep on mute, but do feel free to field in your questions on the chat, and I'll take them later this call. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabrina. And thanks to you, thanks to Bankers Without Borders and all those associated with it. Thanks to Steve and the whole Grameen Foundation team for making this possible. You know, not all founder transitions in nonprofits are smooth. In fact, I think most of them aren't. But from when I said that I was going to step down as CEO to when Steve got in place a few years ago, I think it was a model transition. I give a lot of credit to the team. And since then, the organization has treated me like any founder would want to be treated. And I've tried to be helpful where I could be. And I just want to take this opportunity to applaud the progress and the bold plans of Grameen Foundation under Steve's leadership, and say that Bankers Without Borders and Sabrina have a special place in my heart and always will. Now, I'm not here to try to do a long advertisement for my books. If you want my books, you can get them on Amazon and other places too, if you're not an Amazon person. But I want to really create some value for all of you today, especially if you're involved in nonprofits. But I'm told that probably 3/4 of the lessons that I talk about can be applied with maybe a little change to other disciplines as well. Now, some of you might say, well, what is the relevance of all this to COVID and the pandemic? And I think a lot of the lessons that I've learned that I'll share are kind of timeless lessons about social change, applicable to times of crisis and other times. I did, however, write one blog post to something called Next Billion that I'm going to ask my colleague Meg to put into the chat, where I really did, for once, I did look at my lessons learned applied to the COVID crisis. You can look at that if you want to. Basically, for the last few years, I've been mining my career, first 30 years of my career, to just figure out what did I learn? What did I learn? Not what did I accomplish or what did I fail at, but what did I learn that might be useful to others? And I'm not going to tell you that I'm the only one with insights about leading mission-driven organizations and self-care, or even the best. But what I've done is I've tried to be very analytical about what I've learned, organize my thoughts and insights, and then put them by other leaders and a great editor, so they're presented in a kind of coherent format. And I hope other people will do the same. The lessons I'm going to talk about in a few minutes relate to fundraising, governance, management of the nonprofit, and self-care. I'll only touch on governance very briefly, but we can come up in the Q&A if people want. But let me set the stage first. In terms of, let me give you a little bit about me. Number one, early in my career, when I was actually still in college, I wrote a letter that in retrospect is, I'd call it rather grandiose, audacious, over the top. I wrote to Muhammad Yunus and I said, Professor Yunus, I've got an idea about how your insights about microcredit and other things could be applied globally, and you need me on your team to basically apply that insight and defeat world poverty. And I was at that point 19 years old. I couldn't buy a beer legally in many countries, including the US, but I thought I had the secret to ending world poverty. And you know, the guy wrote me back. I'm still amazed to this day. I'm not sure if the roles were reversed, I would have. And that started a long apprenticeship, about 10 years, mostly living in Bangladesh with him. So that was a very pivotal moment in my life, being audacious and having a mentor respond. Then I'll tell you about something a little different early on. I was, during a brief period in my 20s when I was back in the US, I was working for an advocacy group called Results, a terrific organization. Some of you may be familiar with it or involved. Advocacy on global poverty issues. And on a Friday afternoon in the summer, when a lot of people take off in DC, I got a call from a guy named Mitch Snyder. He just called and he asked for me, and said he was Mitch Snyder. Well, I know who he was. We never talked, but he was a famous homeless advocate in the US in the 80s. He once went on a 52-day fast to force the Reagan administration to give him an abandoned federal building to use as a homeless shelter, and Reagan capitulated. He was that accomplished and that gutsy. And he wanted to ask me to see if results that I was working for could do a favor, could sign on to a letter that he was organizing, just one more of many thousands of things he'd done around homelessness. And I was honored that he called me. I told him I had to check with my boss. And I was just so thrilled on that Friday that I was going to be able to call him back on the Monday to give him the good news. This famous homeless advocate who is willing to do the grunt work of social change, call me, a young person in the field. And so I woke up Monday morning so excited that I was going to be back on the phone with him, except it didn't work out that way. I opened up the papers. I lived on Capitol Hill in DC, and front page news, homeless advocate Mitch Snyder committed suicide over the weekend, hung himself in the homeless shelter that he lived in with the people that he was serving. I was flabbergasted. How could someone that accomplished in the field of social change that I wanted to grow into, be a leader, and be willing to do the grunt work on a Friday afternoon in July, calling a nobody in the field, me, and yet so broken that he hung himself that weekend, couldn't see the weekend out. I couldn't talk for years. I couldn't even think or talk about that. It was so incomprehensible, except 10 years later, as I describe in one of my books, I was on the same trajectory. My health, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, was all going downhill. I had the dream job working with Professor Yunus that I'd kind of created for myself, which was running Grameen Foundation. And yet I was a wreck, and I was driving the people around me in my personal and professional life crazy. And there was one day, a New Year's Day in 2001, where I just said, I'm headed out, I'm heading down. And I wish I could tell you there was one secret, how I turned it around, was continue to work productively on building Grameen Foundation, but not at a personal cost. But there were actually hundreds of things that I tried, some worked and some didn't. But I was able to commit to myself at that point that I would never do my work of social change at a cost to my health, whether it be mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual. And if it ever was, red alert, I would start doing something different. So I've put together, and maybe Meg, you can just put into the chat box if you haven't already, the two books, just to get out of the way. But let me talk first about fundraising. I'll hit 4 topics before we open it up. So one of my insights is actually one of the titles to one of my books, which is When in Doubt, Ask for More. I find a lot of people in social change, when they have an opportunity to ask a foundation or an individual with a lot of resources to be a partner with them, they ask for way too little. And then you've kind of missed that opportunity for a while. So I often challenge people, if they say, we're going to ask for $100,000, I say, why not ask for $1 million? A good reason, often there isn't. And I think, why is that? I think organizations want to play it safe. If a donor has a history of giving it X, we don't want to ask from 3X because it might offend them. But the truth is, and think about what I'm about to tell you. I've had the experience in fundraising, in leading organizations, like as Steve has done and others of you may have done, nonprofits, where people will come up to me and they will say, I will do anything to support your cause, anything at all. I love it. But don't ask me to fundraise. Because why? Because I'm not good at it and I don't like it. And I've come to believe that most people have that view because they see fundraising fundamentally as a zero-sum transaction. It's almost like a little battle, you with the donor. And if the donor can win by saying no, and you can win by getting them to say yes, and you walk away with their money and they walk away with less. And even the way we talk about fundraising, right? We say, if you give me this grant to this organization I care about, I won't hit you up for another year. It almost sounds like a violent kind of a thing. And I'll tell you that I've learned that you can think about it that way. It's very disempowering, but you can also think about it in a way as fundraising, especially major gift fundraising, is about entering into a partnership where all parties win. The donor wins, the fundraiser wins, the fundraiser organization wins, and if the fundraising organization can execute, the mission wins. And I wish I could just in a few minute riff can explain that paradigm, but it's really not, I can't do it. But in chapter 7 of my book, Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind, I talk about how I worked with Janet McKinley, a major donor from my era as head of Grameen Foundation. And she gave $7 million over about 8 years, and she did it joyfully. I shared with her the chapter, and she's like, "You got it right. We had a lot of fun together." So fundraising can be a win-win, but you need to think about it a certain way, conduct it a certain way. So let me lead you to another insight, which is kind of related. And I'll introduce it by yet another. Paul Moritz, a Grameen Foundation board chair, once said to me, when presenting information in this day and age where people are, kind of ADD orientation, is start with your conclusion. Right? Don't tell a story that builds up to your message, but start with it. So let me do that here. I've come to believe that if you're asking people for money, or frankly anything important, you should never, ever, 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 ever do it apologetically or hesitantly. If you're doing it that way, if you feel uncomfortable with it, you probably have some work to do. Either you're asking the wrong person for the wrong thing, or more likely you're thinking about it in this zero-sum way where I want to take away from the other person as opposed to start a partnership with them. So, and the story that goes with it, a few weeks into Grameen Foundation's history, Mohammed Yunus asked me to go raise $10.6 million for a particular project for him. Now, I had at that point raised in the thousands of dollars in my career. But when the big boss tells you to do something, right, Sabrina, you just kind of, yes, sir, I'm going to go do it. And a few weeks later, I was sitting across from the foundation director for a billionaire in New York, new foundation that they'd set up. And I was pitching the project as best I understood it. I wasn't that well briefed. And it got to a point and he asked me, "Well, how much money do you need?" I was terrified by that. In a split second, everything went through my mind. Am I allowed to even use such a number as 10.6 million in a first meeting? I'm 30 years old. I'm new to philanthropy. Is he going to call security? I mean, I was really worried. Like, he may call security on me to get me escorted out as doing something inappropriate. So every bone in my body wanted to basically introduce the number through a long kind of a semi-apology about I wasn't sure if it was appropriate and all that kind of stuff. And honestly, something in me, I wasn't yet a good fundraiser. I wasn't yet even a mediocre fundraiser, but something in me is that I need to own this number. I can't give it to him apologetically or hesitantly. So I just said $10.6 million. And to my relief that I can still almost feel to this day, 20 years later or more, really, he just wrote it down and we continued the conversation. And then he walked out of the room a while later and he said to me, and then fast forward a year, what do the things look like after that meeting? Where about the only thing I did really well was answer that question in a very direct manner. Well, number one, we got our $10.6 million. Professor Yunus was pretty pleased. Not the last time that we delivered for him, but that was important. Number two, the foundation director's wife was the vice chair of Grameen Foundation's board. Number three, as a couple, personally, they began donating $5,000 a year, which was a lot for us then. And the benefactor of their foundation triple matched that every year. And that went on for more than a decade. And I still maintain that if I had answered that question about how much money he wanted in a kind of apologetic, unprofessional, hesitant way, not owning my ask as a way to define the partnership, none of that happens. No 10.6 million, no vice chair of our board, his wife, and no personal donation. So so those are two kind of just things to think about. Let me throw a couple other fundraising ideas on the table before I move on. I urge people, if they're fundraising, if a donor complains to you, celebrate it. It means the donor cares about the relationship. All donors will become dissatisfied from, if it's a big relationship for them. But if they don't tell you what their problem is with your organization, they're probably on the way to leaving. If they're telling you about it, it means they want you to pay attention, fix it if you can, and then to keep building the relationship. And by the way, if you're involved in fundraising in any way, if a donor calls you, call them back that day. or the next day if is at the latest. I was trained by a person who was hired to train me as a fundraiser, that if you're meeting with a major donor, or if you're in sales, he said, don't ever go into a meeting with a major donor if you haven't prepared 4 to 8 hours for that meeting, apart from the travel time to and from the meeting. I'm like, what? What can you do? Turns out to have a high quality meeting, high quality contact, sometimes I would put in significantly more than that. And also just I became very personalized ways of expressing appreciation became very important to me. And I'm a writer, you know, I've written 2 books in the last year and a half. So I literally, in Grameen Foundation and other organizations I led, I've literally written thousands and thousands and thousands of handwritten letters and dozens of long letters of 4 to 5 pages, single spaced in special circumstances to express my appreciation in a very personal way. In fact, sometimes I joke that I think I've kept the US Postal Service in business the last 2 decades through all of these letters that I've sent. So expressions of thank you, and I talk in the books about ways to do that. Let me talk now about governance very quickly. I've never covered this topic as quickly as I'm about to do, but I was very proud of the Grameen Foundation board, and I still think it's an outstanding board. And basically, my 3 messages about board, we can revisit this if you want. Number 1, most nonprofit boards in the US, at least, where I know are dysfunctional. So if you're part of a dysfunctional board, you're in good company, I guess. That's number 1. Don't feel too bad about it. Number 2, if you want to turn a dysfunctional board into a high functioning board, there's no way to do it fast. It's a long process. Mark your calendar 3 to 4 years, not months in the future. And but if you put in the work, you'll get there and it'll be worth it. But there are no quick fixes. And lastly, people will tell you that a best practice in boards is to have term limits. I find that it's a band-aid and in many cases counterproductive, but you need to bring a certain approach to instead of it that we did at Grameen Foundation, at least in my era. And I talk about those in some of the books. So managing people in a nonprofit, passionate people who want to make change have probably given up money, other compensation compared to what they get in the private sector. What did I learn? Well, number 1, I won't be teaching you anything you don't already know to say if you're managing someone and they're successful, reward them with pay, with promotion, with praise, whatever else is value to them. But I came to learn largely how I was supervised by a very critical board chair in our history, Susan Davis, that it's sometimes almost as important to reward failure. What? Reward success, I get reward failure. Isn't that going to create all the weird incentives? See, I think if someone's passionate about the work they do and they work for you and you give them a big assignment and they fail spectacularly. I've done that. Probably most of you have done that in your career. And then if you do the work, very hard work, to understand why you failed, what assumption of yours was wrong that you thought you were sure was right. And that's going to open up a whole area of learning for you as a professional. It might take 6 months. If someone's willing to do that work, they're going to emerge a better professional, able to do challenging assignments better than they could before. I'm absolutely sure of that. And in fact, the lessons they'll learn as they deconstruct their failure, you don't forget those lessons because you're so kind of emotionally scarred by the failure that it helps create space in your mind to never forget the lessons. So I've been rewarding people who failed, but then learned the right lessons for a long time. I have a few regrets. It sounds weird, but I've been doing it. Number 2 is, I'd say very important to create a culture where admitting your errors and failures. We in social change, we're trying to solve the problems that in most cases governments and corporations couldn't solve or maybe even created. These are not easy, most of them. And so sometimes we're not going to fail. So I tell you about, I used to, I was not an easy person to work for in my early years. Let me put it that way. If there are any early Grameen years folks here, they can tell you that was the truth. But I did something, I wasn't very approachable. I was pretty harsh in different ways. And on a good day, I'd say my staff respected me, but didn't like me. I'm just speaking honestly here, but I kind of turned that around by doing something that just, it occurred to me almost the last minute. We were having a staff retreat, and I said to the staff, I said, you know, we've had a pretty heavy duty agenda item. Let's do something a little different. I'm going to, and they're like, okay. And they, by the way, didn't want me facilitating our retreat at the time. They wanted an outside person. I didn't want to pay for it. You know, this is how things were like in a startup. And I said, folks, I'm gonna tell you that the 10 biggest mistakes I've made in the last year and what they cost the organization. I'm like, okay. So I went down the list. Number 1, not so bad. Number 2, that's kind of bad. Number 4, I saved the best for number 4. There was a grant proposal written by a young woman of South Indian heritage who worked for us, extremely smart. I thought it had no chance, so I spent 0 minutes reviewing it and improving it. Turns out we came within like 100th of a point of getting $1 million grant from USAID on that proposal. If I had spent 20 minutes on that proposal, I'm sure it would have been approved. So I said, folks, and we were a $1 million a year organization at the time. I said, we could have doubled our size. I blew it. We didn't. It was funny. Everyone was exchanging these kind of intense glances, not with me, but with each other. And I'm like, what the heck's going on here? Because I never had a conversation like that with them. And I'm wondering, you know, are they taking notes to bring to the board to then, you know, basically get me fired? I mean, what's going on here? But it felt like the right thing to do. Well, basically they talked about that 45-minute session for years. And it was, I think, because they would all say a little differently, is that it made it, I mean, I was telling them that I had set world records for mistakes in the organization. No one could ever catch up to me, especially in the cost of those mistakes. That's kind of what being a leader is. So why would they ever be ashamed of mistakes they'd make? Why can't they just, you know, kind of say, I made it, I learned from it, let's move on. It started to create a culture, which I think is still alive today, of risk-taking and people being willing to not get hung up on, not take a mistake and blame a third party or blame or ignore it, but just own it. In fact, as our board chair, Susan Davis, said, there are 2 types of organizations that regularly shoot themselves in the foot and have honest conversations about it, and organizations that regularly shoot themselves in the foot and don't. And I was like, wait, Susan, there's not a third type where they don't shoot themselves in the foot? Nope. So being able to learn from it and creating a culture, and I sometimes tell stories about how that culture lived on and grew over the years, but it really came from that moment. And it started transforming the relationship that the staff had to me. Because it's one thing to say you made a mistake, it's another thing to actually like really reveal what it costs the mission and the organization, how much better things would be if I hadn't made that mistake. So a couple other things on this, and I'll get to self-care. If you're a boss, probably more than you realize, people are hesitant to challenge your ideas. You put an idea out there and they're kind of censor themselves. And so I used to try to minimize that. I used to say this, Sabrina, you might remember. I used to say, you know, folks, this might be the worst idea of the year that I've had, but here it goes. Let me share it with you. So I'm telling them I'm not even sold on this, so they don't have to be. And so with that kind of humor, just invite criticism of your ideas, take the charge out of it. Like I'm shooting down the boss's idea. You might have a different way of doing it, but that's how I did it. And lastly, I think is, you know, people as a leader, I think we like it when we have people that are A, optimistic, that are always seeing the glass half full in the organization, and B, people that are what I call the true believers, or what Susan Davis would call the owners, the people that treat the organization as an owner would. Think of someone, the opposite being a renter. So think of how does an owner treat their home as opposed to a renter on typically. And to have an owner, to have someone almost treats the organization as if they founded it, right? So the way that Sabrina treats Grameen Foundation, she owns it, you know, as much as I do and Steve does, because she cares that much. And they're extremely important. You don't want to have more, you know, you want to have at least a third of your team being this kind of optimists and owners. But you know what? Pessimists and the renters, they actually have important roles to play too. Sometimes they can do things to give you a sense of what's right and wrong on the organization that the optimists and the owners can't do or have difficulty doing. So while again, the pessimists and the renters, a little hard to deal with sometimes as a leader, they actually can do some things serve the organization really well. For example, the renters are probably going to be gone to another organization in 3 years, so they can speak up and tell it like it is that an owner might not want to do because they don't want to seem disloyal. Whereas a renter is like, oh, I'm only here for another year anyway, so I'll just tell them that I think this program makes no sense. Anyway, so living in life in balance. So one of the things I've felt is that, one of the things about nonprofits generally, I think we try to kind of embody this idea of solidarity, of offering and accepting help, making society better and making each of our lives better. And so one of the things I've tried to do in my life is, in order to have there be kind of coherence between my personal life and my life as a nonprofit leader, is every day I try to accept an offer of help to me that I was initially inclined, maybe out of pride, to decline. And I try to offer help to someone or accept someone else's request for help that I was initially not wanting to grant. And just that simple act of, okay, my initial reaction is no, but maybe yes. It creates a kind of a consistency between what I'm as a moral leader of an organization like Steve is, and the way I live my life when I'm off the field of play, if you will. Now, secondly, one of the things I realized is that I had a fatal flaw as a leader. I think we all have a fatal flaw as a professional. And by the way, if you don't know what it is, ask some of your friends, they'll tell you. But mine was, I sometimes would become very anxious. And while some people respond to anxiety by kind of freezing up, sometimes I wish I would have that reaction to it, I would make bad decisions. Now, probably, Sabrina, when you get anxious, you make some, not the best decisions, but mine are much worse. And so I said, gosh, what can I do about this? And I learned that there was one way to decrease my anxiety significantly, not eliminate it. And it was aerobic exercise for an hour a day, 6 days a week. And folks, ask anyone who knows me, I've been doing that for 15 years. In fact, I'll be working out right after this webinar ends. And so am I encouraging an exercise? Not a bad idea. But what I'm also saying is when you find your fatal flaw, the thing that trips you up, figure out something and you may come up with better ideas in the future that minimizes it. And then apply that thing with as much discipline and get support from loved ones and colleagues if you need to apply it as much best you can. And your life will be a lot better and you'll be a better leader, a better change maker. Lastly, and this one's a little kooky, not the others you might say are kind of obvious, is, and I'll wrap here, I might show a couple slides quickly for 30 seconds, but is that, I found that as a leader, there's a tendency to take yourself seriously, become overconfident, become impatient, a lot of things, or maybe those are things I fall into as a leader, but I think they're a little more common than that. And one of the things I found as a leader is how amazing it is, how important it is to always be doing something, usually as a hobby, that you're a novice or a beginner at. Really, or as someone once said, making the same point, have the courage to suck at something. And something you care about, something that you actually spend time and effort on every day, or at least a few times a week. It takes me to a place where I don't take myself as seriously, where I'm more playful, more curious, more open to ideas, because I'm around people in that domain of my life where I know very little and everyone around me knows a lot more. And I'm always asking the dumb questions and causing people to laugh. And the story I tell it in the Changing the World book is about when I turned 40 years old. We had a party. It was about 13 years ago. So I guess you can figure out how old I am. I went down to Key West, Florida, and I heard a band play a genre of music I wasn't really a fan of, but I was mesmerized. And I went the next night and the night after that and the night after that. And I said to them, I said, I want to join your fan club. I want to talk to your manager. And they're like, we're poor musicians. We don't have a manager. We don't have a fan club. I said, okay, I'll do it for free as a volunteer, not knowing anything about the music industry, not knowing anything about their genre, bluegrass. And I did it for several years. I did it for actually about a decade. But for the first couple of years, I was so incredibly bad at it, embarrassing myself over and over. And, since they didn't have anyone else, they kind of liked me and they didn't have anyone else to do it. They tolerated it. But being And I was going through a very difficult time at Grameen Foundation's history, navigating that. And I was so much better prepared because of that state of mind that I was engaged in something outside of work that I was a novice or beginner at, that I was frankly terrible at, but learning and desiring to learn. It made me more able to learn and question myself and look for better ideas. So, so that's really what I have for you. I'm going to take about 30 seconds here to just see if I can do this, and then open it up. Hopefully, Sabrina, people have asked some questions or will do so. Can you see my screen there? Yeah. So, so just if you've, I've had a lot of free content kind of around some of these ideas, my website, my blog, things I've written, my YouTube channel, consulting practice. I'm going to add you all to my mailing list unless you send us a note that you don't want to be put on it, which is fine. Just make it simple, kind of an opt-out thing. And then I have basically two things I've been talking about off and on, almost free content. This is the book, kind of semi-autobiographical. I talk about it over and over. I tried something new, it succeeded or failed, and then I learned something that changed my career. And these books, so the Kindle versions cost $5, about, not much more than a latte. The paperbacks are a little bit more. And this is the other book where I do 214 lessons. Some of them will be familiar to you from today, across about 7 or 8 areas. And that's what they look like. And I will, I'll just say thank you all for being part of it. And I'd love to see what you all have to say. If you want to criticize some things I say, or say that you've learned some other lesson that's similar or not, or opposite, that would be welcome too. So Sabrina, back to you.
Thank you, Alex, for this heartwarming lecture. I know we've got some questions through the chat and a comment from Princia, who's a current Grameen Foundation employee. She says, Alex, I really admire your honesty and candidness on the good and the bad. I'm also super inspired that you wrote to Professor Yunus. Just thinking that Grameen Foundation may not have existed if it were not for your childlike faith definitely gave me the goosebumps. So, and I think that really summarized some of the spirit captured in your talk. So we'll open it up to questions. So if you could just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. And
Sabrina, we have some in the chat here, right?
I do have, it's mostly comment. I do have one, Sandhya wrote that she's often asked by parents of young kids about empathy. And she, it's a world that my kid isn't empathetic, and but how can they be successful if they're empathetic? How do we encourage parents to raise an empathetic generation? Any advice there?
Well, I see that, and I see another one from Diana about also unrestricted funds. So let me capture those. If I can remember both of them, and then we'll open it up or see what else comes. And thank you for moderating this. In terms of one of the things I learned about empathy applied to this fundraising, and I learned that one of the ways to deal with conflictive situations. I once had a very talented but very difficult employee working for me, and it just ultimately we parted ways. But one of the things that Susan Davis said is think about in her mind why what she's doing that is annoying the hell out of you and others is actually done from a place of principle and a place of contribution, and just get inside her head, because she's not doing it to harm the organization, even though she may be. But and it kind of started with me trying to say, whenever there was a conflict with a donor, with a staff member, with a partner, I just tried to put myself in their shoes, is kind of another way to see it. And in a certain way empathize with whatever, but to empathize, it was helpful to me to, well, what's causing them to do this out of a principle that most people would admire and I would admire. But also empathy, if you really want to do good fundraising for major donors, you need to really understand the world as they see it, not as you see it. And as I say, whenever you ask, what do you do with a donor? It's know thy donor, because what would work with one will fail miserably with another. can't treat it as a kind of a cookie cutter. In terms of unrestricted giving, I just simply say, first of all, one of the rules in my book is if unrestricted revenue falls below a certain level in the organization, you're gonna have problems, even, no matter how big your revenue is. And I felt at Grameen Foundation in my era, if unrestricted revenue is less than 15% of total revenue, no matter if we were raising $20-25 million, the system's not going to work well. That's one of the 214 lessons. And sometimes with business people, I say, well, what would happen if the revenue you had in your business, if 85% of it was designated for one project or another, would that cause you a problem as a donor? Or sometimes I use another example. I say, if people want to limit the overhead, which is a lot of it paid for by unrestricted, I said, you know, organizations bragging, only 5% of our money goes to overhead. I said, well, you want to fly on a plane where the airline brags about how little they put into maintenance? I mean, that's kind of what we're saying here. So I try to just meet people where they are, that if they don't want to give restricted, or they don't want to give to an organization with a reasonable amount that they spend on themselves, on overhead, on their capacity, I try to kind of let them see it through my eyes, let them see it, how difficult it is to manage an organization where things are so restricted and so sparsely resourced that it just is difficult to maintain the social change agenda. Sabrina, how do you want to handle this?
I know, so we have a question that just coming from Nancy. I'll read it. Changing the world without losing your mind is a great title. It strikes me that I've run into many preteens who are very stressed and very seriously nervous and concerned about the future of the world and inequities. Have you ever considered a version of that for the next generation?
I mean, the simple answer is no. Although I do talk about what I was like at that age. I think it's I think that and by the way, I've not, for whatever reasons, it could be the subject of another webinar, but my wife and I, we've decided not to have our own children. So I've not had the joys and sorrows of raising my own teens and toddlers, though I have 4 nephews that are very dear to me. But I think when anyone, I mean, honestly, what is today? On Monday, when I woke up, frankly, I couldn't sleep Sunday night. And Monday, when I woke up, I was feeling hopeless myself at 53 years old. Maybe some of you have ever felt that. And I just think that you know, there are different things that one can do, you know, certain kind of mindfulness practice I've gotten into in recent years, physical exercise, again, dealing with anxiety, but also if you can give people a kind of some way to have a sense of agency, a sense that they are part of the solution, even in a small way, you know, set up young people to be part of that. I just sponsored a essay competition between Indian American youths about philanthropy, and we're going to announce the winners very soon. And just, you know, just giving people a platform to get active, to talk about being active, you know, putting that one foot in front of the other. But I know there may be much better things grounded in you know, child development and teen development research that I'm not familiar with. But you know, but just try to, you know, I think setting people up to feel like they're on the playing field to address the problems that make them anxious, as opposed to in the stands or watching on TV or just huddling in the room. That's about the best that I come up with as a way to start.
Alex, 2 more questions. One from Nero. I'm learning a lot about Alex's journey. If I may ask, I'm also mainly curious on his ideas on a few steps that one could take from becoming more involved in the nonprofit space, in addition to volunteering and potentially doing it more mainstream.
In kind of meaning in terms of it, to move into it as one's career, is that?
Yeah, to get more involved with the nonprofits, Nero, is that's right? Well,
first of all, you know, I encourage people to just find a cause, one or more causes they're passionate about, to find an organization whose culture agrees with them. Maybe it's faith-based, maybe it's not, maybe it's grounded in liberal or conservative ideology. Maybe it's just people who are just nice people, whatever makes it comfortable for you. And then just, you know, offer yourself up to help, and especially since so many people want to kind of delegate or avoid fundraising, see if you can get comfortable with that, and lead with your passion and lead with the idea of partnership with people. And you know, some people who are star volunteers of organizations, you know, often end up on the board or on the staff in time. And especially again, if they're, you know, there's so much more fundraising that needs to be done than there are trained fundraisers, that if you're, you know, a lot of organizations are willing to train their own fundraisers, you know, rather than, you know, accept them trained, especially at the more kind of junior level. So it's, and you know, I have created a resource that I'll send you somehow, unless Meg can find it, my resource on starting a career in the nonprofit or social enterprise sector, more kind of designed for younger people. But it was based on a kind of a conversation I had in the Grameen Foundation offices in 2013 with people who'd broken into the field and had really exciting jobs, and I just asked them how they did it. It's on my I think articles page of my website, Meg, if you can find it and drop it in. But yeah, just, you know, when people are expressing their passion for a cause and willing to do whatever's needed and bring their best selves, their best ideas, their best relationships, whatever money they can afford, you know, as a leader, you just, you hang on to those people. You never let them go. And if they, and you kind of find out what place they want to be and find out a way to get them there. So that's what I would suggest. And don't overthink it. And along the way, try to find some mentors, people like what Susan Davis was for me. They're going to continue to open doors for you, you know, throughout your journey. Once you know, break into one role, then it may lead to another. And have people out on the lookout for great roles for you is a great asset to have.
Yeah, and I want to say that one of our BWV volunteers was also made a board member at Grameen Foundation. One question from Talha. Alex, kindly advise on how do you balance your personal life with your professional life at the nonprofit? Did you have to compromise any of them at any point of time?
Well, this is a really good question. And I think there's a lot of oversimplified thinking about this, and sometimes even dangerous thinking about what, I don't use the term work-life balance myself. It almost, because, you know, work is part of my life. So I'm balancing like work with the rest of my life. And it's not a concept that makes sense to me. But basically, first of all, for short bursts of time, when you have an opportunity to advance social change, sometimes you need to work for a few weeks, like almost nonstop. It's just what makes sense. Now, maybe if I'm in my 70s, maybe I'm not sure I can still do that, but I've been able to do that my whole professional life. But that can't be your way of living. That can't go on for months or years. And again, the thumb rule that I began with in 2001 when I had this epiphany was, I just look every year. I said, every year, I want to emerge the year at least a little bit healthier mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually than I began the year. It doesn't have to be a lot, but I can't go backwards. And if my work or something is making me go backwards, that's not something to brag about. You know, there are a lot of people in nonprofits, well, I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. Well, I haven't taken a vacation in 4 years. Some of my mentors were like that. And I just happen to choose a different relationship than bragging about how my declining well-being in service of the cause. I chose a different course. And so it's just setting that standard and also inviting people in your life. Sometimes I think that I'm doing better in all those ways, but people close to me, if they feel a permission to tell me that that's not true, that I'm kidding myself, that also helps as a reality check. And frankly, since that kind of insight in my early 40s, I've always had at least one hobby that I was doing. Again, often something I was a novice at the time. I'm really committed to my hobbies. I take whatever vacation I was given, I take almost all of it. Because it just gets me, it refreshes me. And if I see people not doing it, but I also say that organizations stumble a little bit if they impose the same model of work-life balance on everyone. You know, if I was leading this, if you were an organization, I was your leader, I'd say, okay, these things I do to keep my life in balance, you all should do them. No, we're all, in fact, what would have worked for me now wouldn't have worked well for me in my 20s and 30s. I'm the same person, just at a different point in my life. So what I try to do is, I think, create a culture where everyone can explore for themselves how they can put their best, bring their best to their job while making sure that they're moving even slowly in the right direction in those areas, you know, in terms of their mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. And that they're encouraged to talk about those things they do, even if they take away from their work at times, and create a culture where that's celebrated, that's not looked at as I'm detracting from the cause.
I don't have any new questions, but if anyone has any comments, questions at this time, you can just go ahead and unmute. And
I'd love to hear someone's voice other than my own and Sabrina's. Oh, hi, Sandhya. Wow.
Yes, we have old Grameenis as well on this call, and a lot of BWB volunteers. I love it.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has any comment, questions. If not, Alex, any closing remarks from you?
Oh, I see someone here said that the thing that they're doing is they're trying to learn Navajo, and I think learning a language is a great kind of humbling experience, opening up your mind. When I learned Bengali, I'm not as good as I used to be, but I'm still decent. It was just a revelation about what I could do. I learned about my own language, things I never learned because of seeing another one. And I just really applaud you for raising that. I think, in fact, one of the 214 lessons in this book is try to learn a new language every 10 years, which I'm about a decade behind in. But that's, anyway, that's a reminder to me to get with it. I would just simply say thank you all for whatever change-making work you've done, you're engaged with, you will be engaged with. I hope some of these ideas are helpful to you. Before Sabrina's closing remarks, I want to thank Meg, my intern and former student, for being so helpful with this and everything since she joined me June 1st. You know, if you want to be helpful to me in this book, you know, I'm not going to retire on what I earn from this book. It's you know, it's inexpensive books, but if you can, you know, get the word out, tell people about it, review it on Amazon if you like it. I'm told that anything other than a 5-star review doesn't really help a book. It doesn't mean you should give the review you think you should give, but just be aware of how the algorithms work. You know, it's and there's a lot of free stuff out there. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, whatever you want. And again, I just very grateful to all of you. Grateful to Steve for leading the organization in such a positive direction in difficult times with this pandemic and other the economic crisis. It's not an easy time to be a leader. I don't envy you. I appreciate you giving your blessing to us doing this together, to your support, Bankers Without Borders, the Grameen Foundation Alumni Network, and again, just offering my support in any way I can to help the organization continue to climb new mountains.
I would like to personally thank everyone for joining us for an hour today for this engaging webinar and discussion. I hope we were able to achieve our goal to have each participant leave with, you know, practical ideas that can be applied immediately, especially if you're thinking of starting your own nonprofit or jump into the social sector. I know all the participants have already or should have received an excerpt of Alex's most recent book, When in Doubt, Ask for More. Alex's books, as he's mentioned, are all available on Amazon. Please do check us out again at bankerswithoutborders.com for volunteer assignments. And do not forget to also visit us at GrameenFoundation.org and learn more about Grameen Foundation's work. And as in the words of Professor Muhammad Yunus, help us put poverty in a museum. Thank you, everyone, and great rest of the afternoon.